Well, hello again, 1010 students. And this time I am going to talk to you in part 2 of my week 13 video about structuring successful argument papers through the Toulmin method. And so to follow along with me, go to content, go to course documents. You'll have to scroll to the bottom of that page and hit load more. And then you'll see this page, Structuring Successful Argument Papers through the Toulmin method. So there was a British philosopher named Stephen Toulmin, and he actually developed a lot of important key terms and strategies and ideas in the understanding and shaping of argument in his book, The Uses of Argument. So, when we think about that word argument, we often think of it in a negative way, like we're fussing and fighting with each other. But in a college English class, argument is not necessarily a negative thing. It can actually be a good exercise if we argue with one another, disagree with each other about a topic in a respectful way, and learn from each other. So that's kind of the way we look at it. Now, some of these ideas we already know. We know that arguments begin with thesis statements or claims, right? And those are debatable statements or assertions that you hope to prove in your paper. So a thesis can be demonstrated using logic, logos, or evidence. And a thesis answers the question, so what? What's the point here? What's the point of this paper? Toulmin says, you know what? There has to be a logical, persuasive connection between your thesis statement and the reasons, the data, the evidence supporting it that you're going to find in your sources. And he calls that connection the warrant. So warrants answer the question, how exactly do I get from my main claim, my thesis statement, to my evidence? How do I connect it? And that warrant is the assumption that makes your thesis seem plausible and logical. So here's an example. Here's a thesis. There are many folk traditions concerning the defining features of poisonous mushrooms. However, there are no general identifiers that apply to all poisonous mushrooms. That's hard to say. Therefore, such traditions are unreliable guides, and the use of folk traditions to try to identify edible mushrooms causes mushroom poisoning. So basically what this thesis is saying is that, there are all these wild mushrooms that grow out in the forest and whatnot. And there are all these old wives' tales that people tell about, how to figure out which type of mushroom might be poisonous. But there aren't any general identifiers that apply to every single type of poisonous mushroom. So therefore, if you're just relying on some old wives' tale to figure out, which one of these mushrooms you shouldn't eat, you might not should do that because you could get poisoned and die. So you need better information than just, some tradition. So the thesis needs that logical, persuasive connection to the evidence that you're going to use so that it can be supported. And that connection, that assumption is the warrant. And here it is in this case. Since we know that eating poisonous things are dangerous, right? Therefore, it's really not too smart to just rely on some old tradition or some folk remedy to figure out which mushroom is going to kill you. You might want to actually make sure your information is accurate. So here's another example that that we might be able to wrap our heads around a bit more easily. Here's a thesis. Elderly drivers suffer from deteriorating conditions that affect their eyesight, eye-hand coordination, and reflex use. Therefore, there should be a cutoff age for all older drivers in the U.S. So what's the warrant here? Well, since we all know that elderly people suffer from these conditions, since as you get older, your eyesight usually isn't as good, your coordination, your reflex use isn't as quick, then it may be that perhaps you're not going to be able to avoid accidents as easily because you can't see. You can't turn to look around you and see what's coming as quickly and as easily. So therefore, it might not be too smart to allow people with those conditions to just be driving around, right? So that's the warrant in that case. It's the thing that makes your thesis feel logical and plausible. Remember that entering an argument is like walking into a conversation already in progress. So you've got to acquire some background information on the history of your topic, on the audience that you're addressing, on the possible oppositional arguments, pro and con, that are going to be raised, and the way in which you can properly, effectively, and respectfully, using ethos, address and refute those arguments, because that's going to be part of paper 4. Acknowledging the counter argument, saying, yes, here's what people who disagree would say, and then offering a rebuttal to it, refuting it, coming back and saying, yes, they say this, and they might have a point in this way, however, they're not correct. Here's the correct way to view this, and here's why. So you have to do some reading and some research anytime you're writing a successful argumentative paper, and that's why you need another source, with this last paper. So Toulmin tells us that qualifiers, and this is going to haunt you on a quiz probably, qualifiers, and those are words or phrases that place limits on our thesis statements or our claims, play an important role in creating an effective argument. So Toulmin encourages us to limit our responsibilities somewhat in an argument through the effective use of these qualifying words. So now I'm going to give you a claim that is totally unqualified. People who don't go to college earn less than people who do. So I have not qualified that in any way. I haven't given you any characteristics about these people who don't go to college, who earn less money. But when I add a simple qualifier phrase, I make my argument more reasonable and harder to poke holes in. Because if I said that to you and you wanted to challenge me, think about what you could easily, quickly say in response. You could say, now wait a minute. What about all these gazillionaires, these very highly successful people who didn't go to college, or who maybe went for a little while and dropped out, or never even went to begin with, and yet they have earned all this money and all this respect, and they've done all these great things? You could quickly and easily find these examples in real life and just shut my argument down just like that, because I haven't qualified it. But when I add a simple qualifier phrase, then my argument becomes more reasonable. In most cases, there's my qualifier. In most cases, people who don't go to college earn less than people who do. So in most cases, frequently, sometimes, some individuals who don't go to college, I'm going to qualify it in some way. So now let's take that idea about qualifiers and apply it to our thesis about mushrooms. There are many folk traditions concerning the defining features of poisonous mushrooms. However, there's a transitional word, however, experts agree that, there's my first qualifier. I'm not saying that I am saying this. I'm saying there are experts that I'm going to point out in my paper who agree that there are no general identifiers that apply to all poisonous mushrooms. Therefore, it seems clear that, there's my next qualifier. I'm not just flat out saying such traditions are unreliable. I'm saying it seems clear that they're unreliable guides, and the use of folk traditions or remedies to try to identify edible mushrooms is arguably a frequent cause, there's my last qualifier, of mushroom poisoning. So it's arguably, I can argue it, a frequent cause. Maybe not always, but frequently. So now let's apply qualifiers to the thesis about older drivers. Elderly drivers, though they may be kind and conscientious human beings, there's my first qualifier. So I'm not saying, all these elderly people are just a bunch of old curmudgeons and a bunch of old farts, and we should take their licenses away. I'm using some ethos there. I'm using some respect. Sometimes, there's my second qualifier, they don't all, but sometimes suffer from deteriorating conditions that affect their eyesight, eye-hand coordination, and reflex use, thus possibly impacting their ability to drive safely. There's my next qualifier, possibly, not always. A cutoff age for all older drivers in the U.S. offers a viable solution to this growing problem. So I'm saying it offers a solution. You know, maybe it's not the perfect solution, but it offers a solution. So see how I've qualified it? So the goal is to create a thesis and an argument that uses good old-fashioned psychology to reach your audience. And by the way, you can use this in your real everyday life. You know, if you qualify something and if you use respect when you're addressing someone who disagrees with you, they're going to be far less likely to just attack you or shut down or not even listen or respond to what you're saying. So as a writer, you want to express your views in a way that causes your reader to respond as favorably as possible to your ideas. And this is true in a college paper. This is true in life. Some of your readers may already be adamantly opposed to your position. And especially if you're writing about a topic that is super controversial or a topic that is sort of a hot topic, as in the vaccine topic right now. So don't alienate your reader who disagrees with you even further by offending the reader or by expressing just an opinion rather than relying on research and some expert backing, or by using language that feels really narrow-minded. Instead, use those qualifiers to soften the blow. And you might want to give the opposition something. You know, admit that the opposition might be right in certain ways before you come back and offer a rebuttal. So Toulmin gives us an outline of the ingredients to write an effective argument paper. We've got our thesis, our main claim. We have our qualifier that we add to that. We have our warrant, the assumption that makes our main claim seem plausible and connects it to our evidence. Then we have our evidence. We have our expert authority, sources we can quote that are reliable. We have our conditions of rebuttal, and then we have our response. So let's take the idea of the elderly drivers. The thesis, a cutoff age for all older drivers in the U.S. offers a viable solution to this growing problem. And then we've got our qualifiers that I just went through with you. We've got the warrant that I already went through with you. Since the older people may suffer from physical conditions that impair their ability to drive safely, thus endangering other people on the road and themselves, it might be wise to legalize some sort of cutoff age, right? Now we need our evidence. So we might look for statistical information. We might go on a .gov site and look for how many accidents were caused in 2020 or in 2021 or whatever in the state of Tennessee by elderly drivers. We might find books or journal articles or other kinds of articles on the subject that offer factual evidence of our argument. So we might go to procon.org. We might go to Opposing Views in Context database on the library's website. We might look for quotes or paraphrases from personal accounts of people who have been involved in traffic accidents caused by the elderly. So we gather our evidence. It's going to appear in the body of our paper. We've got our authority, or our authority, as they say on South Park. We're going to cite those experts, those who know the subject well, to establish your own ethos as a writer and to back up your claims. Now, we need some conditions of rebuttal here. So you've got to be thinking anytime you're entering an argument, okay, what are those who disagree with me going to say? And how can I then respond to them? So here's what an opponent would likely say. Look, not all elderly people are affected by conditions that impair their driving ability. And a law that legalizes a cutoff age for everyone would be grossly unfair to those people. And in fact, that kind of a law is going to create hardships for older people who live alone. And how are they going to get to the grocery store? How do they get to their doctor's appointments? How do they have any kind of quality of life, right? And those are valid ideas to consider. So now you've got to think, okay, how can I respond to that while still maintaining my stance? And how can I do it respectfully? So you might want to give the opposition a little bit. Here's an example. While, there's a qualifying word, It is true that not all elderly persons are affected by physical conditions that impair driving ability, so you're giving the opposition that. You admit it. They're not all affected. It is also true that a good number are affected, as the following research study clearly shows. Boom. Insert quote here, right? While, qualifying word, a law legalizing a cutoff age for elderly drivers would indeed be unfair and burdensome to some. So you're giving them that. You're admitting it would be. One may argue that, there's a qualifying phrase, the lives saved justify such a measure. Perhaps, there's another qualifying word, a compromise may be reached through legalizing periodic testing for the elderly, eyesight, reflex, and hearing tests that will ensure the public's safety. So now notice how the response to the opposition's rebuttal attempts to meet the opposition halfway by admitting, you know what, some of these claims are very reasonable. They make sense. And then by coming back and offering a compromise. So whether or not you use those particular techniques of response or rebuttal to the opposition will depend on how logical the opposition's ideas might seem and how reasonable a compromise might seem. So I give you a list at the end of this document of different qualifying words that should be helpful to you in using those in your argument paper. So to qualify, that doesn't mean that you're going to back down off your argument always, but it just means that you're going to create a situation where it isn't quite as easy for someone to come along and just instantly destroy your argument if you qualify it a little bit. And it means that you do need, in this argumentative paper, you do need a counter-argument presented. You need to show the view of the opposition, and you need to think about what the opposition is going to say about your claims, and then you offer that rebuttal, that response back to it in a respectful way. So hopefully this was helpful, and I will see you in my next video musings.